What if you've been walking through life underestimating your own allure, not because it isn't there, but because your mind, in its effort to protect you, keeps it hidden? What if the mirror you've used to see yourself has been fogged by experiences, judgments, and silent emotional wounds? You may not believe you are attractive, not truly. You might describe yourself as fine for my age, average or invisible, especially after years of being overlooked, underappreciated, or emotionally dismissed. But what if this belief isn't truth, but defense? What if your ego, loyal and subtle, has quietly shielded you from seeing the full power of your presence? There's something profoundly painful about acknowledging your attractiveness, especially when life has trained you to think otherwise. It stirs questions. Why didn't they choose me? Why was I betrayed if I am desirable? Why do I feel invisible when I enter a room? These are not vain questions. They are emotional ones, intimate wounds dressed in logic. And your ego, through its defense mechanisms, steps in to protect you from that pain. Not by solving it, but by veiling the truth. In Freudian theory, the ego is not your enemy. It's your mediator, caught between the instinctual hunger of the id and the punishing conscience of the superego. But in doing its job, it sometimes uses blindfolds instead of solutions. It represses, denies, rationalizes, all in the name of emotional survival. So what happens when a woman no longer feels seen? When years of emotional neglect, manipulation, or indifference have turned her inner mirror toward shame instead of power? The ego steps in and whispers, "Don't look too closely. It's safer not to hope." But repression has a cost. It doesn't just hide pain, it hides potential. And one of the most quietly repressed aspects of feminine power is self-recognized attractiveness. Not in the commercial sense, but in the deeper sense of being felt, being noticed, being worthy of admiration and desire. Perhaps you've brushed off compliments, laughed when someone called you beautiful, dismissed a glance as coincidence, not because it wasn't real, but because something inside you felt unworthy of believing it. This is where Freud steps in, not as a distant figure but as a symbolic interpreter. He'd say, what you reject in the conscious mind often lingers in the unconscious, and what is unconscious still shapes you. To question your self-perception is to begin a quiet revolution. Because if your unattractiveness is not truth but defense, what then? What might emerge if the veil lifts? So I invite you to sit with this question until the next chapter. What if the silence you feel around your beauty is actually a defense against disappointment? To understand why you might not see yourself clearly, we need to understand the role of the ego, not as an enemy, but as an interpreter of reality shaped by your emotional past. The ego is not your true self, nor is it your shadow. It's the negotiator, positioned between the primal urges of the id, which seeks pleasure, validation, hunger, and connection, and the stern demands of the superego, which carries inherited rules, guilt, and shoulds. The ego must craft a version of you that feels acceptable in the world. But this version isn't always accurate. It's adaptive. Let's say you were raised in an environment where being noticed for your appearance brought discomfort, jealousy, or even punishment. A parent's scorn, a sibling's ridicule, or perhaps your beauty attracted the wrong kind of attention, the kind that made you feel unsafe. In such cases, the ego learns, visibility is dangerous. Attraction brings pain. Better to stay small. This is where defense mechanisms begin to take form. The ego doesn't erase your attractiveness, it disguises it. It tells you stories like, "I'm not that special. They were just being polite. I don't want to be seen as vain." These aren't just thoughts, they're shields. And over time, the shields become identity. Mechanisms like repression, denial, rationalization, and projection work quietly, unconsciously, like internal software running in the background. They aren't there to deceive you. They're there to protect you from the emotional dissonance between what you feel and what you were told to believe about yourself. For example, if the id longs to feel beautiful, but the superego punishes that longing with shame. Don't be full of yourself, you're too old for that. Real women don't care about such things. Then the ego must settle the conflict. And it often does so by dulling the desire itself. You stop seeing your own beauty not because it isn't there, but because it's emotionally inconvenient. Freud believed that much of what we deny in ourselves doesn't disappear. It simply goes underground. And there it lives, influencing our relationships, our choices, our silence. You might dismiss flirtation, avoid mirrors, undervalue your presence in social spaces, not because you are unattractive, but because it feels safer not to wonder. But the cost of this safety is emotional blindness. You begin to walk through life as if you're invisible, and that belief begins to shape how others treat you. The woman who doesn't recognize her allure stops inviting recognition. She stops receiving it, not because it's no longer offered, but because she can no longer feel it. So I invite you now to reflect on this. What if the version of yourself you've accepted is not the truth, but the compromise your ego made to protect you? This is not about vanity. It's about visibility, psychological visibility, and reclaiming the right to feel seen, not for someone else's benefit, but for your own liberation. Repression is subtle. It doesn't erase, it buries. Like a careful archivist, your psyche tucks away thoughts, memories and desires that once felt too dangerous to hold. Not because they were false, but because they were emotionally unsustainable. Many women have repressed their sense of attractiveness, not because they never felt beautiful, but because feeling beautiful once led to pain. Perhaps when you were young, a moment of being admired brought discomfort, the wrong kind of attention, perhaps from someone who should have protected you. Or maybe your attractiveness sparked rivalry, jealousy, or rejection in your family or social group. You learned through lived experience that being desirable meant being exposed, and being exposed meant being hurt. So the ego did its job. It repressed. It buried the knowledge of your own radiance deep beneath safer identities: modest, hardworking, smart, quiet, dependable. And it whispered, "Don't remember how it felt to be desired." It's easier not to know. Repression is not forgetting. It's the act of keeping something unconscious. You can function, thrive even, while your true feelings remain locked in the basement of the mind. But the body remembers. The ache for recognition, the subtle sadness when others are seen and you are not. The pang of envy you don't quite understand. These signs are not flaws. They are signals, clues that something in you still longs to be unearthed. Freud might say, what you repress does not vanish. It organizes your silence. Look closely at the habits you've normalized. Do you dismiss compliments automatically without processing them? Do you feel embarrassed by photos where you appear attractive? Do you dress to blend in, not because you want to, but because you don't want to be noticed? These are not just preferences. They may be the echoes of repression, the result of your ego protecting you from a pain that is no longer present, but still feels emotionally real. There is no shame in this. Repression was at some point your mind's solution, but you are not the woman you once were. You are stronger now, and with strength comes the capacity to feel without crumbling. To bring repressed truths to the surface, we must first create safety, psychological safety. Not in the world, but in your own internal dialogue. Begin simply. Choose one photo of yourself where you felt genuinely radiant, not performative, not filtered, but alive. Sit with it. Notice the discomfort, the urge to criticize, and then ask gently, what am I afraid will happen if I admit I was beautiful in this moment? This is your practice, not to become attractive, but to stop denying that you already are. And that denial has a history, a function, and now an expiration date. Because when you repress your own allure, you unconsciously teach others to overlook you. But when you reclaim it, quietly, without needing applause, your presence shifts, not for validation, but for truth. Have you ever admired another woman's beauty? Not just her physical appearance, but her presence, her ease, her magnetism, and felt a strange blend of longing and distance, as if her radiance were a world you could never inhabit, only observe? What if that admiration wasn't just about her, but about you? In the Freudian framework, projection is one of the ego's most common and cunning defense mechanisms. When we cannot accept a feeling, a desire, or a trait in ourselves, we see it more vividly in others. Not because they possess it more, but because our unconscious needs a place to deposit what we cannot hold. You may recognize this in jealousy, that sharp pang that says, she has something I don't. But it also appears in admiration. She's beautiful, confident, effortless. I could never be like that. Projection is not always hostile. Often it's tinged with reverence. But the problem is not in the seeing, it's in the disowning. When you project your buried sense of allure onto another woman, you create a silent barrier between your potential and your identity. You place beauty out there, on others, for others, and deny its roots within yourself. Freud might suggest, what you admire most, you have disallowed in yourself. This isn't wishful thinking, it's psychological displacement. Imagine a woman, middle-aged, reserved, emotionally cautious. She watches another woman in a cafe, relaxed, elegantly dressed, speaking with ease. She thinks, she's what I'm not. But if she looks deeper, she might recall, she once was expressive. She once had that energy, until someone told her it was too much, or not enough, or didn't fit the role she was expected to play. So she buried that energy, and now it returns, not as a memory, but as projection. This is how the ego protects you from the grief of lost potential, by making it seem like it never belonged to you. But the truth is, your unconscious knows. It knows that the women you're drawn to are not accidents. They are mirrors, fragments of your own denied essence. And here lies the invitation. Instead of seeing other women as examples of what you lack, begin to ask, what part of me have I projected onto her? Is it sensuality, confidence, emotional warmth? Ask not what she has, but what you've buried. To integrate projection is not to imitate others. It is to recognize that what stirs your soul in another is often a forgotten language of your own. Freud doesn't ask us to reject projection, but to read it, to follow its thread back to ourselves. Because what we deny in ourselves will keep seeking expression, and projection is simply its most poetic disguise. So here's your symbolic task. Next time you find yourself in quiet admiration of another woman's presence, write it down. Not about her, but about what she awakens in you. And instead of saying, I wish I had that, try this. This is a part of me, asking to be remembered. There's a voice inside you that rarely rests. It criticizes, it compares, it shames you for wanting to be seen, and then punishes you for feeling invisible. It whispers things like, you're too old for this. You're not special. Don't be so full of yourself. That voice is not truth. It is your superego. In Freudian psychology, the superego is the internalized authority, the accumulated voices of parents, teachers, culture, and religion. It develops in childhood and becomes the inner judge of your desires, impulses, and self-image. It believes it is protecting you from humiliation, from rejection, from stepping outside the lines. But in doing so, it can become tyrannical, especially for women who grew up in environments that discouraged confidence, sensuality, or self-celebration. You may not remember the moment it began, the offhand remark from a parent, the look of disapproval when you wore something bold, the silence after you tried to speak your mind. These moments don't just pass, they settle into your psyche, and they give shape to the superego's script. Be humble. Don't outshine others. If you're attractive, people will think you're vain. It's safer to be modest, invisible even. And so your ego, trying to keep peace between your desires and your internalized moral codes, often chooses suppression over expression. It dulls your awareness of your own appeal, not because it isn't there, but because your superego deems it inappropriate, risky, or undeserved. But the superego is not inherently cruel. It is conditioned. And what is conditioned can be changed. Imagine for a moment how different your self-perception would be if your internal voice said, it's okay to feel beautiful. Your presence has value, even when no one affirms it. Being seen is not shameful. These are not affirmations, they are permissions. And women who carry harsh superegos often need to begin not with praise, but with permission. Freud would argue that maturity involves the weakening of the superego's punitive grip. Not by eliminating it, but by balancing it, bringing awareness to its origins and deciding which parts no longer serve you. Start by identifying the language of your superego. Whose voice is it, really? Whose shame are you still carrying? A mother who feared your independence, a father who saw beauty as danger, a culture that only values youth. When you begin to question the authority of that inner critic, you create space for a different kind of voice, one rooted not in fear but in truth, A woman with a balanced superego doesn't seek permission to feel radiant. She doesn't need to prove her worth, because she no longer believes in the lie that it was ever in question. So here is your practice. Each time you hear that inner critic speak, pause. Do not argue with it. Ask it one question: whose fear am I carrying right now? And then remind yourself, you are not a threat to anyone's comfort just because you've chosen to no longer apologize for existing. There is a quiet grief in realizing how long you've lived under the shadow of a distorted mirror. Not because you chose to, but because you were conditioned to see yourself through the eyes of others who couldn't hold your light. Perhaps they were afraid of your presence. Perhaps they were too wounded to affirm you. Or perhaps your early environment taught you that safety was found in being invisible. But invisibility is not your nature. It was a survival strategy, one your ego carefully maintained by repressing, projecting, and internalizing messages that were never yours to carry. Freud didn't see the human mind as a battlefield of shame. He saw it as a system built to protect us. The ego, the superego, even our unconscious defenses, they all arose to preserve stability when the truth was too heavy to hold. But what once protected you may now be the very thing holding you back. You are not too old. You're not too late. The mirror can still be cleared. Attractiveness, true, soulful, self-owned attractiveness, is not something you need to earn. It's something you remember. It is the energy of a woman who has returned to herself, who no longer shrinks to avoid discomfort, who no longer projects her light onto others, who no longer lets a voice from the past dictate how much of herself she's allowed to feel. You do not need to be loud to be radiant. You do not need to dress a certain way or seek approval. But you do need to recognize when you've been hiding behind self-doubt, when your ego has kept you from standing fully in your presence. So I leave you with a final reflection. What would change in your life if you truly believed, not hoped, not wished, but knew, that you are deeply, naturally, and unmistakably attractive in your own way? You don't need to prove it. You need to feel it, in your posture, your breath, your quiet knowing. And when that knowing settles in, your behavior begins to shift. You say no without guilt. You walk without apology. You see others without shrinking in comparison. Because a woman who sees herself clearly does not chase confirmation. She emits it. If this reflection spoke to something buried inside you, something you've always sensed but never fully claimed, I invite you to share it. In the comments, reflect on a moment when you downplayed your allure. What were you protecting yourself from? What are you ready to reclaim? And if you haven't already, subscribe, not just for more insights, but as a symbolic act of returning to your emotional clarity. There is so much more to uncover. Together, we'll keep unlearning the lies and recovering the truths your ego thought you couldn't bear. But you can. And now, you will.